Our final two presenters are Christian Appy and Dalia Wasfi. Christian Appy is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts. Born in Georgia in 1955, Appy went to college in the mid-1970s in the wake of the Vietnam generation. He is the author of Working Class War, American Soldiers in Vietnam, and Patriots, the Vietnam War Remembered from All Sides.
Hi, I'm Chris Appy. It really is an honor to be with all of you here today, and I hope my words can do some justice to the occasion. You know, in the years after the Vietnam War, many Americans believed that one of the central lessons of the war was that never again should our foreign policy be so aggressive. Never again should the policymakers be so unaccountable to Congress and the public. And in the future, we really had to open up our foreign affairs to more democratic input. Well, unfortunately, in the 30 years since that war, and especially in more recent years, the institutions of American power have taken a very different lesson from the Vietnam War, and our foreign policy has become even less democratic, more secretive, and more unaccountable. So we're left with these very depressing realities. Now entering our 6th year of this military engagement, which is our second longest since independence. So I'm sure you, like me, listening to this testimony, are searching a bit for some basis for hope. And I want to talk a bit about that. I found myself during the last couple of days thinking a lot about the extraordinary image painted by Pablo Picasso in 1937, one of the great anti-war paintings of the 20th century, Guernica, which was to depict this small Spanish town that was leveled by fascist bombing. It renders a picture rendering civilians and animals destroyed by this bombing. It is necessarily and properly a very bleak and depressing image. But if you look at it closely, you will see that in the bottom of that picture there is a small flower growing out of the wreckage. There is some basis for hope, even in the most dire times. And I would have to say to you that being here does give me some hope, and that the testimony of these veterans is what that hope is based upon. The courage they have shown in trying to make some meaning out of their experience, and more than that, collectively to try to bring an end to this war, truly does offer some hope. You know, in 1971, the Vietnam veterans against the war energized and inspired an anti-war movement that was becoming increasingly divided and dispirited. And so too now, these veterans are bringing inspiration and energy to the anti-war movement. I find some hope as well in the effort to try to clarify the mechanisms that produce war and have prolonged this occupation, the kinds of economic, military, and ideological forces that bring us to this point. Racism is, of course, a very important and undeniable feature of this war, yet hardly talked about in the mass media. Even oil probably gets more of a mention than racism. It has been a force that has shaped all of our wars, at least internally, and most of our foreign wars, particularly our wars against 4 Asian enemies over the last century. Indeed, the racist epithet gook probably has its origins going all the way back to the war against the Philippines 110 years ago. As has been eloquently stated by a few of the panelists here, while we all have responsibility for racism and its roots are incredibly deep, it really does come from the top in very important ways. Because while all of us share certain prejudices and maybe even some racist thoughts. Racism does not really become virulently violent unless it is given sanction by the state and by the powerful. And it has been given sanction and license from the very top in this occupation. George Bush may not, as far as I know, have uttered the word Haji in public, but virtually everything he's said about the war creates the groundwork for racist thinking. His description of the world in black and white terms, good versus evil, you're either for us or you're for the terrorist. He paints great swaths of the globe in the language of civilization versus barbarism, clearly depicting an enemy world of inferiors that certainly fuels the racism that has been discussed here today. I've been particularly moved by hearing so many of the testifiers describe their motives for going into the military, how deeply they wanted to do good and to serve their country and to help the Iraqi people. Of course, they were lied to by the most powerful. Cheney, you'll recall, said that we would be greeted as liberators when we entered Iraq. Others said that it would be a cakewalk, that we would be developing democracy. These veterans are telling us a very different story. They were greeted not as liberators, but as invaders and as imperialist occupiers. These circumstances of counterinsurgency warfare and occupation are a kind of perfect recipe for producing violence against civilians and non-combatants. And we heard a lot about that in the panels on rules of engagement. A recipe for inflaming hostility on all sides. But you know, the people that create this policy are really not taking the responsibility for civilian loss. Quite the opposite. They blame it on the very people that we have heard from. This, they say, is an exceptional kind of event, marginal to our main effort, and the work of a few bad apples. These policymakers put our military personnel not only in deep physical jeopardy, often with not even sufficient supplies and armor, but they put them in a kind of moral jeopardy, in which they were put in sort of an impossible situation and asked to do the right thing and given a set of rules on a card, and then told that, well, if all else fails, do what you think is necessary, and we'll back you up, maybe, after you have responded, made your own decisions about what's necessary force. What I guess I most want to emphasize is that we were all tainted by this war, not just these veterans. And war brutalizes us all. There may be sitting here today veterans and people elsewhere in the country and around the world who listen to some of these accounts and think to themselves, well, I really have nothing to add to this testimony. I didn't commit, I didn't kill anyone, I didn't torture anyone, I didn't rape anyone, I didn't even see anybody do that. What can I possibly add to this testimony? Well, plenty. Because just being in these circumstances, as I say, can be brutalizing. I'll tell just one quick story from my work on the Vietnam War. I interviewed a man named Wayne Smith, an African-American medic who's been a supporter, actually, of IVAW. He said that during training, he made a promise to himself that when he got to Vietnam, whatever else happened, he would never use the word gook, because he fully understood how how quickly a word like that could be turned upon him. But he said, really, within a short time in Vietnam, after being in combat and seeing some of his comrades die, he broke his promise, and he used the word. And he lives with the pain and the guilt of that to this day. There are many stories like that. They're not big and bloody atrocity stories, but they're stories of the various ways in which war can brutalize people. I've interviewed veterans from the Vietnam War who still to this day beat themselves up over the fact that they saw someone hit by a truck. They witnessed it and didn't speak out against it, or saw a villager beaten up and didn't say anything. And we've heard accounts like that in the last few days.